They cast her out into the frozen dark. They thought the void would claim her. But tonight, she walks back through the palace gates, carrying the one secret that could burn the entire universe to ash. 10 years ago, the galaxy lost its princess. Tonight, the galaxy will wish it had. An eclipse swallowed the capital sky. Light withdrew until the dome above the palace felt like the inside of a tomb. Stars blinked out one after another. Lanterns burned like tired teeth. The wind moved through the columns with a sound like cloth over bone. She returned as the sky turned new. Her cloak was torn and stained. Her boots carried dust from worlds with no maps. Her hair lay damp and plastered to her neck. Her eyes shone like molten gold. Those golden eyes changed the room. Guards who had rehearsed emotion for a decade had no shape left to offer. Armor made a thin shiver and then was still. Old vows stirred in places that did not want to remember oaths. Time had been practiced here like a skill that could be ordered and timed. The memory of her leaving had been cataloged under treason and then filed away. The throne room had kept its breath. Tapestries hung heavy with the dust of peace. The carpet that led to the throne was a muted river worn hollow by feet that once moved with less caution. Servants waited like statues. The emperor sat on a throne carved to look like a mountain. He wore the halo of a ruler who had weathered decades and storms. She walked a path that seemed to split the air. The guards parted without words. The opening was not for a parade. It was for a reckoning. Eyes watched from behind shutters and from balconies. Children who had never seen her face except in books held their breaths. Elders who had once loved her looked as if they had passed through fire and were only just cool. At the foot of the throne, she stopped. She did not bow. She did not kneel. She stood like a figure from a contract that refused compromise. The emperor leaned forward as if he might learn something by peering more closely. His hand rested heavy on the arm of carved stone. The room was tuned to the small sound of his breath. She reached into the folds of her cloak. Her fingers closed around an object that seemed too small for the history it carried. She drew a prism from the dark. It was made of obsidian and cut into faces that ate light. The prism was smooth and dense, and it fit into the hollow of her palm like a seed. When she let it fall, the prism struck the stone with a note that the palace had not heard in living memory. The note did not echo so much as settle. It was a clean sound that the guards felt in the place where certainty used to live. The object lay on the step, and the room leaned toward it. First, the prism trembled. The tremor began like a hand finding a pulse. It did not belong to any war machine. It did not belong to weather. It felt like life being remembered. Candles shifted. A drape lifted and then settled. The tremor became a pulse. The slow beat matched the bones of things that had once been alive. Light failed to read the prism. Black facets accepted and did not return. Even so, the object warmed. It exhaled a subtle glow that touched the stone and then vanished. That glow was not steady. It breathed. The pulse accelerated. It did not stroke in the rhythm of any known engine. It suggested instead the cadence of a heart that had been hidden and then found. For a moment, the palace pretended not to believe its senses. Scribes who had been taught to record in straight lines lowered their tools and watched as if the world had become a play where the script had been lost. The emperor sat very still. Power had taught him to make decisions by measuring the space between his hands. That space had narrowed. He had once rerouted fleets by the curve of a finger. Now an object the size of a palm made his fingers need the stone armrest. His eyes did not leave the prism. Memories came unbidden to those who stood near. A field of tall grass under a sky that wore 2 moons. The sound of a bell in a market square. A child chasing a creature that could not possibly be more than a stray thought. These visions fell like small leaves that revealed more than they covered. She watched the prism as if she were reading a page that only she could see. 10 years had been spent mapping absence. Each map had traced back to a small beat in the dark. She had followed constellations that were not on any chart. She had trusted the pull of a pattern that could be recognized only by a heart that had once known its echo. The guards found themselves without commands. Their voices had been trained to fill rooms. Those voices lay hollow now. Weapons felt absurd near a thing that pulsed with memory. The palace that had once given orders to whole fleets now waited for the next flicker from a small stone. The prism responded, its pulse rearranged into a cadence that reached for meaning. The sound that rose from it was not speech, but it had the shape of language. It brushed at the edges of hearing and then formed into a thing that resembled a name. The syllables that emerged were older than the empire. They fit in the room like the last piece of a map. When the sound resolved the air, accepted a curve that belonged to a name. That curve moved through the room like a current. It touched portraits that had hung for generations. It balanced on the lips of the guards and then drifted into the corridors where private memories kept their company. The name found a place inside the throat of the palace, and it had weight. It carried the years of absence and the small tenderness of things that had been kept safe. The sound of the name did not shout. It entered like the first rain of season and left everything damp with possibility. Her face did not change. The gold in her eyes shone with something of recognition. Her shoulders shifted in a manner almost invisible. 10 years of wandering had led her to this pulse. The maps she had traced had finally become a path. She had come not to beg, but to return with what she had been searching for. The room moved without a single ordered motion. A child on a balcony covered their mouth. A servant who had not slept in days found her hands folded between her knees. The scribe who had raised the stylus first set it down, and then picked it up, and then set it down again. The histories that would be written after this day would begin at the point where the name rose and did not stop. The prism beat on. Its cadence pulled more than memory. It seemed to open the thin seam that divides what is from what might be. People felt themselves remembering futures. They thought of decisions not yet taken and of regrets that had not yet formed. The pulse became a tide that touched each present with a suggestion of another possible world. Then the prism did an impossible thing. Its tremor gathered into one tight note, and that note arranged itself into the clean shape of her name. The palace heard it as if it had been waiting for a sound to justify all the silences. The whisper of the prism was exact. It filled the space between the emperor and the runner of the tapestries. It moved across the stone and softened the edge of everything it touched. Her name was spoken by a thing that could not have known the private curves of her face. The name did not need to be called across an empire. It landed like a claim made and upheld. It was at once an answer and an accusation. The sound reached into the place she had stood as a child, and then out where she had wandered as a fugitive. It pressed against the portrait that once reminded the court of a princess who knew the language of stars. It rested on the frame that had watched her absence and made the varnish seem like a thin skin stretched over time. The prism whispered her name. 10 years before her return, the rift belt lay stretched across the void like a scar on the face of the galaxy. It was a place where navigation failed and signals died. Only those with nothing to lose crossed its frozen corridors. The space that was never still. Shards of dead worlds drifted in slow spirals. Storms of dust and stone moved like living predators. Stars seemed far away as if the rift had swallowed light itself. Serenia drifted in that black gulf. The exile had carried her through border stations that refused her passage and across moons where her face was posted on the walls of markets. She had left the capital with a bounty that could buy a planet. The emperor had not simply removed her. He had made her a warning. Her name carried a weight in the underworld. There were those who hunted her not for loyalty, but for profit. In a rift belt, that meant her presence was already known. The alien raiders came in a tide of black hulls. Their ships had angles that bent light. No beacons marked them. They came without warning. They cut her escape with nets of plasma that bled across the void. Their weapons struck her craft until panels peeled away into the dark. She moved in the small space of her cockpit and read the death of her vessel in every flicker of the gauges. The rift was a place where no one came to rescue exiles. No distress signal could pass the storms. Out of the void a ship appeared that should not have been there. It was patched with armor from half a dozen vessels. The hull bore burns that told of old battles. Its shape was wrong for any known fleet. It moved with the kind of precision that spoke of someone who knew how to survive in impossible spaces. It passed between her dying craft and the raiders. Turrets unfolded from its skin and cut arcs of light through the enemy hulls. The raiders scattered. Some fell into the rift storms and were ground to dust. Others limped away into the dark. She awoke later in a narrow cabin. The air smelled of metal and oil. The walls were scarred with the marks of weapons' fire in time. A man sat in the far corner. His face was carved by old wounds. One eye was clouded. His skin bore the record of burns and blade cuts. He was human, but carried the stillness of someone who had spent too much time among enemies. He offered no kindness. His presence was not mercy. It was survival. In the days that followed, she learned the truth of her exile. The Emperor had not been content to send her away. He had changed her blood. The healers who had once sworn to guard her life had worked their science in secret. They had turned the code of her body against itself. Her womb was a hollow chamber. The possibility of her line had been erased. The royal bloodline would end with her. The Emperor had ensured that the star charts would never again carry her name in succession. The knowledge grew in her like a second exile. It was not enough to survive. She now carried the truth that even if she returned, her lineage was a shadow. She could not give the Empire an heir. The law would seal her away even if the people welcomed her back. In the far spaces of the Rift Belt, she carried this wound without visible mark, yet heavier than any chain. The man who had saved her was called Kale in the outer routes. He was known as a smuggler who could cross impossible borders. His ship bore no allegiance. He traded in relics and data cores, and things the empires declared lost. He spoke of places beyond mapped space where the laws of physics shifted like tides. He had seen the relic they called the Celestial Core. He had heard the old records speak of its power to create or annihilate. It was said to be the heart of a dying star captured in crystal form. It could birth worlds or burn them to ash. The core was not just a legend. It was a weapon and a promise. In the wrong hands, it could erase fleets. In the right hands, it could seed new suns. Kale spoke of the core as if it were alive. It was said to choose who could touch it. Many had died trying. Those who failed were burned from the inside out. Those who succeeded were never seen again except in myths. They found the core in the wreck of an ancient station drifting beyond the rift. The station was a broken crown of metal around a sphere of blackness. Its corridors were choked with the frost of centuries. Machines sat silent with dust in their joints. The heart of the station was a chamber without windows. In its center floated the core. It was smaller than the stories. It looked like a fragment of crystal suspended in a halo of faint light. Its surface shifted with colors that did not exist in nature. Looking into it felt like looking through time itself. It pulsed faintly like a slow heartbeat. The air in the chamber was warmer than the frozen halls behind them. It felt as though the core had been waiting. She stepped forward as if pulled. Kale watched without movement. Her boots touched the circle of the chamber floor. Her hand rose without command. The core's light deepened. It turned toward her as if aware. When her fingers closed around it, the light surged. The core did not resist her touch. It accepted. The stories had said it would burn intruders instantly. Instead, it pulsed through her hand and into her arm. The warmth became heat. The heat became pain. She felt it travel into her chest and down her spine. It was not the fire of destruction, but the fire of inscription. Something was being written into her. The armor on her arm began to glow. The plates hissed. The metal softened under the pressure of the heat. Then the armor split as a mark burned through it from beneath. The sigil carved itself into her skin. Its lines were sharp and bright. It was a design no one living had seen. The mark glowed with the same impossible colors as the core. The pain drove her to her knees, but she did not let go. The core floated free again when it was done. Her hand fell to her side. The sigil still burned faintly in the flesh of her arm. It felt less like a wound and more like a seal. The chamber air trembled as though the core had announced its choice. Kale stepped forward but did not cross the boundary of the circle. His eyes read the mark, and something in his face hardened. She knew without words that the core had bound her. The mark was not decoration. It was a key. It was a brand that would never fade. The core had made its choice, and the galaxy would learn that choice in time. In that moment, she understood that her exile was no longer the Emperor's design alone. The path ahead was now the will of something far older than any throne. The station groaned as though sensing the shift. Metal walls shook. Distant corridors echoed with the sound of collapsing beams. The halo around the core flared once and then dimmed to its steady pulse. It drifted back to its place in the center of the chamber. The sigil on her arm cooled but did not fade. Every heartbeat reminded her that she had been claimed. Outside the chamber, the storms of the rift moved with new intensity. Lightning arced between drifting shards of worlds. Kale led her back to his ship, but the weight of the core's choice followed. The mark throbbed under the fabric of her sleeve. She felt as if the entire galaxy might see it if they looked at her too closely. Somewhere beyond the rift, the Emperor still ruled and still believed her bloodline ended with her. Now, there was another truth moving through her veins. The core had chosen her, and the sigil burned on. The palace did not welcome her return. It tolerated her like a storm held outside by stone walls. The corridors remembered her steps, but now they carried a different weight. The guards who once saluted now watched her with the caution of men standing beside a fire they could not put out. The air in the halls was clean but heavy. Servants moved with the speed of whispers. Eyes followed her and then looked away before her gaze could return. The royal council gathered under the painted ceiling of the Hall of Crowns. Gold light from the great windows turned their robes into banners of power. These were the same faces that had nodded when the decree of her exile was passed. They had aged in the years since, but their smiles had not changed. They smiled as though she were a child brought back from wandering. Yet in the lines of their mouths lay the edges of knives. They spoke in low tones that carried like the hum of an engine. Their words were measured to seem like concern for the empire. Beneath them ran the same current. They demanded her removal. They wrapped it in language about stability and unity. They called her return a disruption. They spoke of the people who might rally to her. They spoke of the danger of division. They did not speak of the core, yet its shadow lay across every sentence. The Emperor sat at the head of the table carved from a single trunk of the starwood tree. His crown caught the light like a promise. He listened with the stillness of stone carved into the shape of a man. He let the council argue. He let their fear wear itself into sharper words. When at last he spoke, his voice was calm. He dismissed the talk of execution with a wave that looked like mercy. He spoke of reconciliation. He spoke of family. He spoke as if the rift between them could be mended with patience. The council lowered their eyes and nodded. None of them believed it. Neither did she. In the public squares, the Emperor stood beside her. His hand rested on her shoulder. The crowd saw father and daughter restored. The banners unfurled in the wind. Flowers were thrown into the streets. Music rose from the steps of the palace. He smiled for the people. She smiled for the people. Between their smiles lay an unspoken truth that could crush cities. The mask of the ruler hid the predator beneath. She had seen the look in his eyes when the crowd was not watching. It was the same look he had worn when he signed the order to erase her bloodline. Night settled over the capital like a curtain. The city lights traced the edges of towers. The moonless sky made the palace glow brighter. She walked through the silent chambers toward her quarters. Her steps echoed in the marble halls. Somewhere beyond the walls, the river moved under the bridges. The gardens lay dark. Statues cast long shadows across the courtyards. The assassins came without sound. They had been chosen for that purpose. Their armor was black cloth that drank the light. Their weapons were curved blades dipped in toxins, meant to still a heart before it could beat twice. They moved through the air like currents underwater. The palace guards did not see them. The Emperor had paid for their silence as well. She lay awake in her chamber. The mark of the core burned faintly on her arm. The darkness in the room shifted. Shadows separated themselves from the corners. The assassins closed in. Their blades reflected no light. Their steps made no sound on the stone floor. She did not move. Her eyes followed the shape of their approach. She had no weapon within reach. She had not called for the guards. She knew this was not an accident. This was a command disguised as fate. The first blade rose above her. The core answered. It did not wait for her hand. It did not need to be summoned. From the sigil on her arm, a light erupted. It was not the soft glow it had shown before. It was starfire. It came in a burst that filled the chamber. The light was white at the center and edged with colors no spectrum could hold. It moved with the speed of thought. It touched the assassins, and their bodies turned to ash before the blades could fall. The fire did not touch her skin. It flowed around her as if she stood in the eye of a storm. The bed was untouched. The walls held their shape. Only the intruders were consumed. Their armor fell in pieces like dry leaves. The air smelled of something ancient and clean. The mark on her arm blazed until it seemed carved of pure light. Then the glow subsided. Darkness returned to the corners of the room. Only the faint glimmer of the core's presence remained. Ash drifted to the floor in silence. The chamber door had not opened. No one in the halls stirred. It was as if the attack had existed only in this space and only for this moment. She stood in the center of the room with her heart steady. The core had acted not as a shield, but as a judgment. It had burned the threat away without touching anything else. Her eyes moved to the balcony where the night wind entered. The city lay quiet. Somewhere beyond the towers, the emperor slept in his chambers. Perhaps he dreamed of a throne without her shadow. Perhaps he dreamed of the day when she had been a child and he had not yet decided her future. It did not matter. The truth was in the ash at her feet. Then the core spoke. It was not a sound that passed through the ears. It entered directly into the space behind thought. It was a voice without gender or age. It spoke with the certainty of something that had seen the birth of sons. Its words were not loud, yet they filled every part of her. They were simple and they were final. One must die for worlds to live. The voice faded. The mark on her arm cooled. The night wind carried the scent of rain from the distant gardens. She stood in the silence with the meaning of the words pressing against her ribs. The core had not said who must die. It had not said when, but it had spoken aloud for the first time, and in that voice there was no space for doubt. The ash on the floor marked the end of one attempt on her life. She knew more would come. The council would not stop. The emperor would not stop. But now there was another will in play. The core had chosen her, and it had given her a sentence that would shape the path ahead. Somewhere in the darkness of the palace, another shadow was already moving. The night was not yet done. The war did not come to the gates. It was born inside them. The palace had stood for centuries as the symbol of unshakable rule. Its walls of white stone reflected the sun in the day and the torches at night. Armies had camped at its borders, but none had breached its halls. The city around it had fallen and risen again in cycles of conquest, yet the palace endured. The throne was carved to outlast generations. It was meant to watch the passing of kings as the mountains watch the passing of storms. Now the threat did not rise from foreign banners beyond the walls. It came from a sky in the shape of ships that carried no imperial crest. They dropped out of the void in sudden formation. Hulls blackened by years of battles glinted in the sun. Their engines left burning trails across the clouds. The first strike split the air with sound that shattered windows along the outer towers. The palace alarms rose in a wail that shook the streets below. Kale had returned. His fleet was not a fleet in the imperial sense. It was a gathering of renegades from broken worlds. Frigates that had once served rival empires now bore mismatched armor and weapons stripped from fallen ships. The crews were soldiers who had refused to kneel after their worlds burned. Kale had welded them together with the currency of trust earned in the rift. Now they flew under no flag except survival. They came to the capital not for conquest, but for a warning. Inside the throne room, the council scattered to their private chambers. Guards ran to the walls. The emperor rose from his seat with a calm that was learned not in peace, but in decades of ruling over unrest. His orders moved through the palace like a pulse. Weapons were drawn from hidden racks. Armor was fastened in narrow halls. The sound of metal on stone rang out like a drumbeat of war. Serena felt the mark on her arm flare before the first shots struck the palace shields. The core was awake. Its warmth moved through her like the memory of sunlight in winter. She stepped to the balcony outside her quarters. The sky was filled with the chaos of battle. Imperial ships rose from the city docks to meet Kale's fleet. The air between them was shredded by fire. The first of Kale's strike teams broke through the western gates. The palace guards met them in the golden halls where mosaics of past emperors watched from the walls. The clash of armor against armor rang under the vaulted ceilings. Blades sparked against shields. The floor was slick with the blood of soldiers who had trained their entire lives for a war that should have been fought far from here. Kale moved like a man who had fought in every kind of corridor. His steps were measured. His armor bore the marks of the rift storms. He cut through the defenders with the precision of someone who had no interest in unnecessary movement. His fighters pushed forward in formation, even inside the narrow palace halls. They had been told this was not a siege for territory. This was a race to reach her before the emperor could bury her in stone. The air in the great hall turned to smoke and heat. Statues of past rulers were shattered by the shock of explosives. Marble pillars cracked and fell in showers of dust. The gold inlay of the walls caught the firelight and turned it into the reflection of a burning sun. The sound of battle was a constant roar broken only by the sharper note of shouts and steel. Serena moved through the chaos untouched. Guards who saw her lowered their weapons for an instant, as if something in their minds faltered at the sight of her. The Corps' mark pulsed through her sleeve. It was not a shield in the physical sense, but it seemed to bend the path of harm away from her. She stepped over the fallen without slowing. Her eyes were fixed on the central stair that led to the throne room. The emperor stood at the top of those steps. Behind him, the great doors of the throne room were sealed. His armor was black and edged in silver. The crown was gone from his head. In its place was the visor of a soldier. He watched her approach without moving. The sounds of battle grew louder behind her as Kale's forces closed in. The Corps surged. It was not a voice this time, but a pull. Her vision blurred. The heat and smoke of the battle thinned. The stair under her feet dissolved into light. She stood in a place that was not the palace. The floor was stone but cracked and blackened as if fire had swept over it. The sky above was red with the glow of a sun too close to the horizon. Shadows lay long and sharp across the ground. Before her stood the emperor. His armor was shattered. The silver edges were blackened. His hands hung at his sides. His face was pale. A dark wound marked his chest. At her feet lay the blade that had made it. She knew without being told that it was hers. The Corps' voice came then. It was clearer than before. It did not fill the world, but it filled her. One must die for worlds to live. The vision shifted. She saw the city below the palace in ruin. Fires burned unchecked. The river ran black. Ships lay broken in the docks. The streets were empty except for the movement of wind-blown ash. Then the scene shifted again, and the city stood whole. The sky was clear. People moved in the streets with the rhythm of peace. The only difference was the absence of the emperor. In his place, the throne was empty. The Corps held the images side by side. The choice lay in the space between them. She felt the mark on her arm burn hotter than the fire in the vision. The Corps did not tell her which future was truth. It only showed the cost. The light dissolved. The roar of battle returned. She stood again on the central stair. The emperor was still there at the top. The great doors behind him still closed. Kale's forces were at the far end of the hall now. The clash of steel was closer. The air was heavy with smoke and the sharp scent of burned stone. The mark still burned on her arm. She did not need the Corps to tell her that the vision was not a dream. It was a fragment of the path ahead. Somewhere beyond this moment, the choice would come, and the Corps had already decided it would be hers to make. The great hall shuddered as another blast struck the walls. The gold mosaics cracked and fell in pieces to the floor. The emperor raised his sword in silence. Kale's fighters pushed forward through the chaos. The moment between was the pause before the next breath of war. Every star here died screaming. Something wanted her to join them. The escape from the capital was not victory. It was survival cut thin against the edge of defeat. Kale's ships broke from the burning sky above the palace and dove into the void. The Imperial fleet gave chase for a time, but the rift routes still answered to Kale's hand. His fleet scattered like sparks in a storm and reformed again beyond the reach of the Emperor's guns. The capital dwindled behind them, until it was no more than a faint glimmer among 1,000 other lights. Serenia stood at the viewport of Kale's ship. The mark on her arm was quiet now, but not gone. It pulsed faintly, as if keeping time with the drive of the engines. Her reflection in the glass seemed older than the woman who had walked into the palace. Shadows of battle still clung to her. The core was silent, but its silence felt like the pause between heartbeats. Kale plotted a course that no Imperial navigator would follow. The coordinates lay across a field of dead systems, known as the Star Graveyard. The place had earned its name in the days when the galaxy was young and reckless. Suns had been torn apart in wars no one remembered. Worlds had been burned until nothing but black stone remained. The wreckage of fleets drifted in the dark between them. It was a place where no trader sailed and no empire laid claim. The first of the dead suns rose before them, as a vast black sphere ringed in pale light. It did not burn, but it glowed faintly from the ghosts of its past. The light shifted in slow waves across its surface. The ship passed close enough for Serenia to see the scars carved deep into its face. Something had struck it with force beyond any weapon she knew. Beyond it lay another sun split in two like a broken jewel. The edges still shimmered, as if trying to remember their fire. The further they moved into the graveyard, the heavier the space became. It was not gravity in the way a planet holds its moons. It was the weight of absence. The sensors flickered with readings that made no sense. Energy patterns rose and fell like the breath of something vast and unseen. The comm systems carried faint sounds, though no signal was sent. Serenia heard them before she could tell herself they were nothing. A whisper at the edge of thought. It was not language, but it carried the shape of meaning. The voices were many, yet they moved as one. They rose and fell like the tide against stone. Each pulse carried a faint echo of pain. She felt the temperature in the cabin drop, though the ship's systems held steady. Kale moved through the controls with the precision of someone who knew the danger. He had been here before, but not this deep. The graveyard did not welcome trespass. He told her what the core's price truly was. One life must be consumed for every new one it created. Creation was not a gift freely given. It was an exchange measured in the weight of a soul. The more powerful the act, the greater the life demanded. There were no exceptions. The core was as old as the first light in the galaxy, and it had never broken its own law. The truth settled on her like frost. The core's mark on her arm was no honor. It was a claim. It meant the price could be taken from her or by her hand from another. The words from the vision in the palace returned. One must die for worlds to live. She had thought it was prophecy. Now she knew it was the unchanging rule of the core. The voices in the dark grew louder. They pressed at the edges of her mind. The shapes of the dead suns outside the viewport seemed to lean toward her as the ship passed. Their lightless surfaces shifted as if the faces of the lost were carved in their depths. She felt the weight of their gaze. Kale kept the ship on course, but his eyes flicked often to her. The core woke without warning. The mark on her arm blazed. Heat flooded through her chest and into her skull. Her vision filled with light that was not from the ship's panels. It was the deep glow of something alive inside her. The pulse of it matched her heartbeat. Slow at first, then faster. The sound of her heart and the sound of the core's pulse merged into one rhythm. She tried to steady her breathing, but the air seemed thin. The light from the core's presence spread through her veins like molten metal. She saw flashes of worlds she did not know. Oceans under green suns. Cities built on clouds. Towers of glass taller than mountains. Then other visions followed. Ruins blackened by fire. Skies torn open by weapons she could not name. For every living world, she saw another dying. The heartbeat quickened. The sound filled the cabin until she could not hear the hum of the engines. Her knees weakened. The core was not just sinking with her pulse. It was drawing from it. Each beat felt heavier than the last. Her vision narrowed until the dead suns outside the viewport were nothing but shadows. The whispers from the graveyard rose in a final swell, as if welcoming her into their ranks. Her body gave way. The last thing she felt was the core's heat at the center of her chest and the echo of its law carved into her bones. Then the darkness of the graveyard took her and she fell into it like a stone into a silent sea. The world returned in fragments. The first was the sound of footsteps on stone, then the weight of cold chains around her wrists, the taste of dust in the air. Light flared against her closed eyes. She opened them slowly and saw the high arch of a ceiling she knew too well. The throne room. She was on her knees before the steps of the throne. The hall was empty but for the guards at the edges of her vision. Their armor was polished, but their faces were stone. The air smelled of incense and metal. She could feel the core still inside her chest. It was quiet but not gone. Its silence was like the stillness before a storm. The Emperor sat above her. Time had carved deeper lines into his face, but his eyes were still the same. Sharp, calculating. His presence filled the hall like the shadow of a great tower. The man who had exiled her now looked down with a gaze that held no trace of surprise. He had expected this moment. Perhaps he had shaped the path that brought her here. The truth came not as a blow, but as a slow uncoiling. Her exile had never been about treason. It had been about the core. He had known she could find it. Perhaps he had known it would find her. He had hunted the relic for decades. Entire fleets had been lost in the search. Worlds had been burned to ash for rumors of its resting place. And all the while the heir to his empire carried the one thing he could not claim by force. Blood that the core would answer to. Her blood. He spoke of the cost of his search. The wars waged. The alliances broken. The lives spent like coin. He had waited for the right moment. A moment when she would be vulnerable enough to return. Now she was here, the core within her reach of his hand. He offered her a choice. Her life in exchange for the relic. Freedom if she surrendered the one thing that made her more than a forgotten princess. It was a bargain built on the weight of old memories. The shadow of a father's love. The promise of survival. But survival was not enough. She refused. The words were silent on her lips, but the core heard them. It stirred, a slow shift like a great beast waking from deep sleep. Heat spread through her chest. Her heart began to pound. The mark on her arm blazed like molten gold. The air in the throne room thickened. The light dimmed though no shadow moved. The guards shifted uneasily, but none stepped forward. The Emperor's eyes narrowed. He saw the change in her. The core's awakening was not subtle. It was a tide rising with unstoppable force. She felt its presence grow. It filled her veins. It pressed against her skin from within. Her breath came faster, but it was not fear. It was power building toward something she could not yet name. The hall seemed to stretch and bend. The sound of her heartbeat was everywhere. The gold in the Emperor's crown caught the light of the mark on her arm. The floor beneath her knees felt warm. The air trembled with a vibration that had no source. The core was no longer silent. It spoke without words. Its intent flowed into her mind like a current. It had chosen her long before this day. It had waited for the moment when choice and fate became one. The Emperor wanted the relic, but the relic wanted nothing but itself. And now it wanted her whole. The power climbed higher. Her skin felt as though it might split. The guards took a step back. The Emperor rose from his throne. For the first time, she saw something in his eyes that was not control. It was fear. The core's pulse and her own were now the same. Each beat was louder than the last. The gold in her eyes burned brighter. The edges of the room blurred. The scent of the incense was gone. The air itself felt alive. She knew the next breath she took would not be the same as the last. And then the core reached for her completely. The core did not take her gently. It was fire without heat, light without mercy, a weightless fall through endless sky. Her body ceased to be a boundary. She could feel the shape of the hall, the thrum of the city, the distant hum of stars. Every atom knew her name. Every shadow bent away from her. Her skin turned to gold from within. The mark on her arm bled light into every vein. Her heartbeat became the core's song. The air split open with radiance. The guards dropped their weapons and shielded their faces. The Emperor stood frozen as though the world had left it behind. She rose without moving. The chains fell from her wrists as molten dust. The floor beneath her feet glowed with faint constellations. The core's voice was not sound, yet it spoke in every particle of her being. She was no longer Serenia alone. She was starborn, Power rolled off her in waves. Each breath reshaped the air. The walls of the throne room quivered. The gold in the emperor's crown cracked and splintered. The banners of the empire sagged under an unseen weight. Her gaze fixed upon him, and the world held its breath. The storm began within her chest. It poured outward in streams of light. The floor fractured. The pillars shook. The great doors of the hall burst apart. Beyond them, the capital burned with the clash of fleets. Kale's rebels and the emperor's loyalists tore through the skies above. She stepped forward, and the palace trembled. Light gathered around her like a living cloak. The emperor shouted something she could not hear. The core pushed her forward. It was her own. The storm broke free. A column of pure light struck the throne. The stones shattered into fragments that burned away before they touched the ground. The emperor vanished in the blaze. His presence was torn from the air like ink washed from water. The fleet that bore his banners screamed through the void as the storm spread. Starfire reached across the heavens. Warships split apart. Debris rained like meteors. Kale's voice was a memory in her mind. She turned her gaze to the void where barren worlds waited. The core's power reached them. Crusts of ice split to reveal oceans. Dust plains grew forests in the span of a heartbeat. Skies filled with clouds. Air thickened with the breath of life. Kale's flagship floated near one such world. His body lay still upon the deck. His face was calm, a smile on his lips. He had seen the death of tyranny and the birth of worlds. The battle ended not with surrender, but with silence. No ship dared fire. No soldier dared move. The light receded into her skin. The core was no longer a separate presence. It was woven into her heartbeat, into her breath, into the marrow of her bones. She stood alone in the ruins of the palace. The empire was leaderless. The sky was hers. She left the capital without a word. The Starborn needed no throne. She moved through the void as both weapon and seed. Worlds bloomed in her wake. Old wounds in the galaxy healed under her touch. But for each life she created, the price still came. One for one, the balance the core demanded could not be broken. A year passed. The star graveyard was silent as it had always been. Dead suns hung like black scars in the dark. Among the ruins of drifting worlds, a signal pulsed. A salvage crew answered. They found a small vessel adrift where no ship should have been. Inside was a child. No name, no record, no past, but the child's eyes were molten gold. And somewhere far beyond the reach of their scanners, the Starborn felt a shift in the core that was now her soul. The galaxy had not yet told its last story of her blood.